When it comes to Citizen Brick, the first thing you probably think of is just quality prints and cool characters, or maybe you think of the cool accessories that they use to decorate those. But I think there is probably something in the middle of that where it is cool molded parts to enhance a minifigure, but also printed. But overall, I just think there is a very cool fascination with some combination of just cool parts, very cool molds, and just the idea of how that all came together. And looking at my backlog of molded parts that I haven't reviewed yet, it just made me realize how many new custom molds have been coming out, whether it is their spray can type bottles with the, easy squeeze or actual spray paint, newer releases of their special molded cans, the very cool barrel mold that they've done in a couple different releases, and of course all the different head pieces or even headgear that they've released over the years. Lots of really impressive parts coming out, but where did they get their start? With custom parts with their minifigures. And with that being said, in this video series, I'm going to go through the basic chronological order of custom molds from the start to the present. Do my best to keep it accurate, but let's jump into the first molded part. The first entry is going to be a bit of a cop-out here since I don't actually have the mold, but they had an exclusive brick arms for their Planet of the Apes line, which was for the ape gun, and like I said, was a mold by Brick Arms. It wasn't made by them, but they did have some custom fabric cape pieces for the tattered rag look here. It would be worn around the minifigure. They've done obviously a couple of these over the years for different characters. For the most part, it's going to be different apron designs. Do have a couple different versions of that, whether it is Texas Chainsaw Massacre or just their Kiss the Cook one for one of their giveaway figures. I think fabric parts, they are custom pieces, so definitely going to count them here and bring them up, but not when they actually started molding their own pieces. And from what I can tell, the first custom part that they actually made was in May of 2017 when they started making their bongs. Unfortunately, I don't collect a lot of the Botany Enthusiast minifigures, so gonna have a little bit of an incomplete history here, but I do believe this is pretty similar to the original design that they did. Obviously, over the years, they've done a lot of different variations to this, but there's also another very cool custom part that's been pretty common over the years, started around that time too. Another handheld accessory being their triple molded cigarette, which is one of their more impressive pieces with the tan, white, and also the trans orange at the end there. They've done multiple cigarette style pieces, whether it's a cigar or a blunt. So you'll see those pretty often if you have been collecting for a while, and fits pretty nicely into a hand, being a bar width around. I just think that is a really cool thing and adds to characters. I have one of these usually on my John Constantine minifigure, and we'll see another really cool handheld accessory kind of in the same vein later on. The cigarette was in August. The next ones here are in September. That is when they developed their mold for the baby head, which has been seen a ton of times throughout the years. These two here were actually part of my first Citizen Brick order when I started collecting. They originally started with actual babies. They have a couple different designs for that. Going forward, we have like skeletons, the whole nativity scene with like sheep, baby Jesus. They had one of these for everything. These are just two of my favorites that I have in my collection. And I'm sure we'll see more of these later on too as they keep putting out new products. But it is one of those curious cases where it feels like a Lego piece, being like the Lego headlight, tile brick thing. But you can see right there it has the CB logo printed on the inside of the mold, and is very similar, like I said, to an official part, but it is custom and just fits the build they want to do for their babies here a little bit better. The next one that I don't have is going to be from November 2017, and it'll be the little mistletoe hat from the elf from one of their freebie Christmas packs. So very cool piece. It's a couple different molds there. We'll see something similar in the more modern molds, but really cool to see that for free. And also part of that release was their S&M squad. And I don't know if this is one that they would have molded themselves or if it is a Brick Arms, but you can see that there's that molded accessory there to go with the dominatrix there. But obviously, before I started collecting, so I don't have a ton of information on those, February 2018 introduced a minifigure with their custom molded drumsticks. This is a later figure to use the same mold. The first one was their Heavy Metal Enthusiast version 1 or 2, I think, whatever. But this is what they touted as their first injection molded piece, so I'm not sure how that works when I've already showed some other pieces. Maybe they outsource some of the molds or something, but like I said, allegedly the drumsticks here are their first injection molded minifigure based off of a post showing them off like that. Looks pretty good. I think the scale, probably a little bit long maybe, but it's tough when you're kind of balancing the thinness with the length, but they look like what they should, and obviously there's going to be a lot of instrument custom pieces later on. So excited to kind of look at those as they're coming out. Another fabric piece was introduced for their Handmaid's Tale minifigure from May 2018. So another case where they're making a very cool part, but getting around actually needing a mold using fabric. August of 28 brought another S&M squad with a rubber whip type piece now, which might have been custom made by them, maybe by somebody else. April 2019 for Citizen Brick Day 6, I think was kind of a turning point for the company and introduced the V1 for the tall head and the two head and double head, whatever you want to call it. I do not have a V1 of the tall head, which was a little bit taller. I do have a V1 though of the double head there, which is actually modified for the newer versions where you can see the original head, the holes in the stud still. The other one has a solid stud with the CB logo molded onto it. So interesting to see that change over time. Like I said, the tall head used to be a little bit taller, and you can see here the original designs that came out in that first wave. Still would have fit like normal Lego hairs and everything, but you know, I believe like a brick taller. And as we go on, this would kind of give birth to like the Citizen Brick, like cursed Lego collection. They've released a ton of different molded heads over the years, and this is where it started with these two different versions here, but the big head is yet to come. In that same release, we'd also see the mold for the Amish hat, which originally came in light tan as well as black unprinted. Of course, now it's been molded and printed on several different colors, especially with the most recent Brick World. That release brought, you know, a lot of these parts to be more readily available, and they were available separately for purchase on the site even. So it was very accessible to get these. There were even more figures that came out in that release, like the Whip It Enthusiast V1, which came with the mold for the Devo hat for the first time. Again, like the Amish figures brought back for this year at Brick Fair for the first time, and then also released on the site. Another great mold, and was very excited to pick this up in, you know, red. Since I did miss the original release for this, it was nice to get this, as well as I picked up another misprint being dark purple on the website at some point. So I now have, you know, one better for my collection. I got rid of my lavender one, but this bright light yellow is a misprint technically from the base, just plain yellow, but I think this color was a bit more accurate, which is nice to have. And I alluded to it with the cigarette. They also made a very cool molded lighter with a separate mold for the flame to plug into that, so it could be trans orange. Really like their single accessory packaging. I think it is pretty nice just to have it in the bubble like that visible, and will also just fit pretty nicely into a hand. I did already mention it, the flame is able to be removed. Just be careful since it is a very thin flame connection like the ones that Lego have. And after taking it out, you can replace it with pretty much any other Lego accessory that has that size of pin. So you can adjust the flame size, anything else you want to do with that, or if you just want to have no flame, act like it's before it's lit up. But I think this looks really nice. Having the metallic pearl silver coloring works really well, and is nice to pair with the cigarette or any of the other, you know, cigarette shaped accessories that they've done. Also released at the same time in Brick World in 2019 was their custom molded stick, as well as bamboo, which I don't have one of, but is pretty much the same concept. Obviously just, you know, bamboo shaped. The stick is kind of an interesting mold. I would really wonder why they would feel the need to make something like this, but if you got a bunch of them, I'm sure you could kind of make some cool build designs. But got one here, and, you know, very unique part of Citizen Brick history, I guess. Another cool minifigure accessory that was available during Brickworld Chicago that year was also an exclusive convention minifigure year, with the White Sox as well as the Cubs being sort of a split Chicago fandom here for baseball. And this was the first time a retail doublehead was available. So thought it would be kind of a neat thing to include here, since I do have this minifigure, and is one of the more fun sports ones that are in the collection. Later in August of 2019, they released another minifigure that I don't have with their Conehead minifigure, obviously with the molded head and another fabric piece with some nice metallic fabric for it. I've been close to buying this one over the years, but I'm not super familiar with the topic, but they've made a lot of SNL figures. I think this is one of the more interesting ones, especially with the mold. Released in that same wave, they did have their first set of pop cans, which is actually two molds here with the handle being separate and the tops of the cans. In addition to the, you know, actual six-pack here, they've typically included a single one as well. So they have three separate molds for this sort of series of things that they've done. They've done all sorts of beers, different sodas, so it's kind of a nice little fun collection to get. Of course, you can hold it with a minifigure hand with the handle, or slide the can onto the hand, and it hadn't been introduced yet, but you are also able to use their big hands eventually, which are perfectly sized for a 1x1 round brick. So that was a nice little bit of compatibility that they thought of. After the sticks and bamboo in September of 2019, they developed their first barbed wire piece. This is their newer system, which has stud connections. Originally it had bar and clip connections, and similarly to the stick and bamboo parts, they came in packs of 10. Like I said, though, it's interesting that it came with clips and then a bar end, so a little bit different what they ended up developing. Of course, that became a whole system with fences, curled barbed wire, and these are really handy parts, especially if you're going to be into mock building. The next month in October was the first time that they introduced the candy corn head, which has been molded in a couple different colors and a couple of different designs. Some of the more modern ones, which are the ones that I have in my collection, they've done like a zombie one, which I don't think was this year, was later on. But I think this is one of the more fun heads. They've printed it even with like a Christmas tree design. So I think it is pretty versatile and fits with your, sort of cursed custom mold heads. So I really appreciate those. In that same drop was the leather face with the robe we already looked at, but it was the first time they also included a custom molded mask, which is glued to the head for Jason Voorhees here. Came with 3 different options for the torso colors, but I think these mask pieces are really good, and especially with the printing on them, really awesome. I feel like they've molded these in a couple different parts and have been available in the stash boxes, but for the most part, I've only ever gotten the minifigure one here and one more that we'll see later on. For November, they had a new hat piece, being the sort of, I guess, Heisenberg hat, now with that also being another figure that has been released with that. I want to say bowler hat, but it's not. Bucket hat, I guess, maybe would be what it's considered. And it was interesting. They're developing these new molds, but at the same time, kind of stuck in like older designs where they've definitely improved over time, like the printed sleeves here being molded now in current minifigures. So it's nice to see them pushing themselves forward on the mold side. And of course, as time went on, the prints got better too. They also had a winter freebie to go along with this release. And for the holidays in 2019 December, they had 2 custom molds included with their freebie, being the reindeer minifigure. Don't have the base one, but I do have the horns from a later on giveaway, and also a candy cane that I think I got from a stash box or tin. I think both of these are really fun molds, and especially in the holiday theme. In February of 2020, they shared their mold for the fanny pack. This would have been the first minifigure to have it in a retail release. Of course, beginning of 2020, things got a little shaky, and I'm going to assume that their production kind of slowed down a little bit because of COVID. They released this very cool molded head before everything shut down, though. And I think this is one of the cooler pieces. I'm glad I was finally able to kind of track one down, since it has like a bar connection at the top there. Little tiny stud looking thing. And obviously probably supposed to be a normal head kind of stretching, or like a maybe big head condensing down. But I think this is one of the more interesting custom molded heads for sure. But June would be Citizen Brick Day 7. The molded mask would return for Lord Humongous. There's also a molded pistol. Not 100% sure if this was brick arms or not. Could be a custom piece by them as well, but nice to see the printed mask returning in a new color. This would also be the first release of the Pinhead minifigures, which would come back when I started collecting, with, the red stripe for the bowling pin, and of course a neutral face. Molded sleeves also included here for maybe one of the first kind of wider release times. So that was also a nice little upgrade for figures. And I really like this mold too, and I'm glad I came back this year. October of 2020 would bring a ton of new molded parts with different prints, like the big head, which has been a staple of the Citizen Brick lineup for a while, and the drippy head, which was printed as ice cream, and also some melted faces. They've done a couple of different pieces with that mold, and of course even the big hands were released at the same time, which is also pretty widely available in a lot of different colors for retail now, and it was nice to see that introduced. I already showed it off a little bit earlier, where you can fit a 1x1 round brick in there, so it's nice and still part of the Lego system. The big head is also interesting, where it has a anti-stud on the top, and a little bit too wide for other things to slide over it, but they have made some different hairs and hats that we'll look at in the future. November would have an interesting rubber mold, being the chicken, which has been released in hard plastic as well now, but I think this was originally part of like a Svengoolie minifigure that I don't have. In addition to that, there are a bunch of other minifigures, like the Pee Wee Herman, which we used this minifigure hairpiece originally in black. So nice to see them introduce a new hairpiece, and one that has been used, I believe, for other things as well. I'm not sure why it would be in brown then. In that same release, we had the more cowbell guy played by Will Ferrell from SNL, so it's another one of those figures in the collection. Has the molded cowbell as well as the molded drumstick again. Got the Fury from the Warriors, so that has molded sleeves that are printed. Baseball bat, which I'm pretty sure is a Brick Arms piece. This is still going to be an official Lego hat, but that will be molded by them eventually in the future. But another very cool hairpiece, which is glued to the head and lines up perfectly with a hat, so you're able to seamlessly have them together for different combos. They've done a couple different hairpieces now with that same concept, and I think it works pretty well. This November, custom molded guitars were also introduced with Prince here, and his cloud guitar, I think, whatever that is called. This is obviously going to be one of the more unique shapes since it is pretty much exclusive to Prince in the musical world, but it was nice to see them have a very nice printed, very cool molded part that would have additional molds added to that collection eventually. And to top off 2020 and 10 years of Citizen Brick, we had a couple different molds. The sort of bow ribbon part at the top of the box, as well as a molded hip piece for this another SNL figure, Dick in a Box character. So they've done something similar to this that we'll look at in the next part, but interesting concept to have it molded around the torso like that. It's something that Lego would typically do, and pretty much is the same mold as their fanny pack, and I'm sure that was kind of shared assets between the two of those, but the drilled out hole onto the official Lego brick just fitting in there, I think that works pretty well and created a very fun minifigure for the collection. In February of 21, we had a new mold of guitar, being the more death metal looking one here for one of their metal enthusiasts. Also in February was their custom molded stand for minifigures. I think I got this one as like a freebie in order at some point. I'm not sure how many people actually put their minifigures on these, but I do believe they still have them in the store today in a lot of different colors. But it's a nice little concept, and I do really like the stand as their logo. Great execution on that part. As a first teaser in May of 2020 for Citizen Brick Day 7, they posted a picture with their molded sandwich board here, and this was the original print that was released as, some more rare minifigure releases or a collection of parts that they had as fig barfs, basically. This has been released multiple times, like their basically business card for Bricks and Minifigs and Citizen Brick, and for February was remolded in pink for this mobile kissing booth minifigure earlier this year. And then Citizen Brick Day 8 came, and I think this is one of the biggest releases of custom parts and really shows like a turning point in the company in regards to molding their own pieces. They had teases for multiple guitars for minifigures that released. They had Ripley from Alien with the flamethrower, which was going to be dual molded with red as well as the gray, and a port for a Lego feather flame type piece or any other part that would be compatible with that. For maybe the first time, they had two different characters released at the same time from the same franchise, where they also had a chest burster minifigure, which would have a drilled hole into the chest, as well as the molded xenomorph piece, which again will be drilled to the same shape as the Lego feather piece, so you are able to swap pieces if you want to, but obviously be careful when you have a smaller pin connection like that. Obviously it could get broken if you're not careful. They had a 12 pack of donut heads, so there were a bunch of different options for this mold in a couple different colors, a couple different designs, a little bit of repetition where it is just color swapped for that original dozen, basically representing, like an actual dozen of donuts. So there's a little bit of variety there, but that has been common in multiple releases now, and I think it is another fun option for a mold. And kind of closing out that lineup of minifigures from the wave, we had Hannibal Lecter, molded mask, and the sleeves for the straitjacket, which I believe are two separate molds, might only be one actually, and glued. And while all of those had teasers on their socials, one thing that didn't was the original pyramid head, which was like a dollar sign Illuminati type one in purplish or lavender, but had a four-side, Illuminati symbol in different colors. Was able to track down this mold eventually, but I don't have the original minifigure. And a final part of that Citizen Brick Day was blind bags of molded parts, so kind of hard to say exactly what could end up in it, but based on the picture that they posted as teasers, they had under molded condom hats. I would assume that things like the poop prototype would have first appeared in that. For sure, the original mold for the voodoo doll unprinted, though, that was in the teaser picture that they posted. And I just have to assume other prototypes like the cane, they had fidget spinner molds that came out at some point, so I'd say this is kind of my catch-all for just random pieces that might exist. Probably came out in these packs to start with. After that initial large parts release, they did officially release some of these in conventions and on the site with the condom hats as well as the plastic APS chickens, which have been staples on the site. I'm not sure if this one has still been available, but I know they made multiple versions in different colors. August of 2021 had the release of Eazy-E, which would have had their custom molded bottle of alcohol, as well as, I believe, probably one of the first uses of their custom molded hat. I'm not 100% sure since I do only have the version 2, but maybe it was introduced at that point because it seems like from pictures it's the same looking piece as this one. The bottle's seen a couple different uses, but I think for the most part only in this case here. But the print on that looks great, and it is nice to just get real world objects for different builds if you wanted to. Later in August would have more botany enthusiasts with different shapes of bongs, and then in September we would have a military release with a new custom molded hat that will be seen later on to release in different colors, and also the first Citizen Brick combat knife, which currently is also included in the stab pack. So nice to see their accessories come back more readily available outside of a figure purchase. And this would have been printed on the original figure and originally dark green, but this is the only one I have. Late September would have more releases for guitars in a couple of different shapes, obviously different designs, some for minifigures, whether it was Sid Vicious with his bass, which would also be used later on for the Ramones minifigure they did. There'd be a left-handed bass for Kurt Cobain, which I don't have in the collection. A new molded hairpiece in that same lineup for Hulk Hogan, which fits pretty well with friction, no glue needed in this case. Would have also had a printed guitar to go with that one too. October of 21 would see the release of Snake Plissken, who would have the custom molded gun here, which would come back in the re-releases, as well as the other character from Escape from New York that they made last year, I think. But it was a pretty cool gun, had some nice texturing, but you can see like some sinking in the mold, but I feel like they are getting in an area where they're making some pretty cool accessories that do enhance minifigures for sure. November would have multiple new molds for their Soprano set. They had a new molded cap for Junior. In addition to that, they also had Magnum PI with another molded hairpiece, which would wrap around the head. Same method as those, with the hat fitting pretty flush with that. And this Lions hat would be used on multiple figures. They had a multi-pack for The Shining, which would have 2 new dress pieces, one of which being the shorter version here, which was eventually used for Reagan from The Exorcist. They had a longer one too that I don't have in the collection for Wendy, and also a Danny hairpiece, which again has also been reused in a small version here, but also a version made for big heads for Dee Dee Ramone here, obviously in tan originally, and this one has seen a little bit of use since it does fit that sort of 70s, 80s era pretty well. And as a final couple of molded pieces in January and March of 2022, this is catching up to when I started collecting and feels like a pretty good natural cutoff point for this first part. The molded voodoo doll finally came printed and was officially released like as a one-off piece that you could buy and not have to gamble with a blind bag. And they had more guitars come out like the Flying V here, which also has been printed multiple times and I think molded in different colors too. So going to be pretty easy to find that. And let's just gather together some pieces and go over some comparisons for the first part. Even though this video stretched from 2016 to 2022 on released parts, this doesn't even begin to touch the surface on most molds, since pretty much after the fact from where we looked at today, every figure has at least one custom mold, some of them have 2. And this covers the whole section of minifigures that came out with custom molds before I even started collecting, so a lot of this is going to be, just based off of pictures on social media, and I definitely probably missed something. So let me know if there's anything you know about that I did not list, put in the comments. But a really wonderful evolution of parts, and to see them kind of ramp up as time went on. Lots of obvious improvements to different characters since they're actually able to tackle them pretty accurately, but also just the fun little molds like the double heads, like the tall heads in the back, their big heads, or even donut heads, just adding to the fun and creating their own little brand of jokes and humor. Plus, everyday objects like the cigarettes, the lighters, all of those sort of parts are really great to get to enhance scenes if you're building a city, everything like that, if that's what you're into. The fabric pieces, they're pretty ahead of the time for getting to something like that, especially the more apron look, which pretty much imitates the sort of way that Lego does that sort of thing. But, I definitely think the custom hair pieces, the custom hat molds are probably some of the best parts that they put out to make the characters that they want to. And the fact that they're able to bring them back for version 2s for different examples like these two is great for collectors to be able to get a version of the character as time goes on. They're improving the prints at least, or even adding things like molded sleeves. So there's still an incentive to even people that got the V1 to get version 2s. And I think the testament of a mold is if it comes up again, whether it is drumsticks, the molded mask for Jason, and then also for Lord Humongous, and all the different weirdly shaped heads that end up coming around in different themes for different holidays, or even just, again, random hats. I think the biggest improvement that I've seen so far is how they went from the printed arms, like on the Beastie Boys minifigure there, to the molded sleeves, which we've seen a couple different times, especially the ones with the printing are definitely stand out. But I can also definitely admit that some of the custom molds definitely go to finalize a character as what it should be, especially in the guitar realm, where they've done all sorts of different shapes where you can pretty much represent any character in the music world that you probably want to with their specific instrument. But again, I do think the comedy aspect of a lot of the parts definitely add to the charm of Citizen Brick, but also, just making some really cool pieces to make a minifigure what you would want it to be is definitely the key to their success over time. But let me know, out of this first sort of history, I guess first half maybe even, are there any custom molds that really stood out to you that you've really loved? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more custom Lego or Citizen Brick videos specifically, check out all the content on my channel. If you want to help out the channel even further, feel free to join as a member. Like always, I have been Brick Radiap, and I'll see you in the next video.